因为我们今天有一位特别的讲员是用英文的哈，所以我开始要用英文。So thank you again for joining CGW 4.0 Career Panel number 3. We'll continue with our series on how Chinese immigrants can break career glass ceiling. So we had an introduction, and we also had a section on communication focusing on small group and private setting, and also networking. And if you miss these sections or you want to review them, please go to our YouTube channel. Today, we're going to cover the second part of the communication, which is a very important part in terms of how can we give a very good presentation. And today's talk, we have two parts. The first one will be given by Justin Strong on how to give an effective presentation. The second one will be given by Mercy on how to talk like Ted. So I'm going to stop sharing now and ask Justin to share. And at the same time, I would give a brief introduction. He's a product marketing manager, and for wafer and component part of the Western Digital. In his spare time, he teaches on presentation, and so before he joined the marketing group, he was a technical person, had one patent, I believe, but he has a 30 years experience in consumer presentation, doing presentation to consumer. He's also a president of a Vanguard Toastmaster Club. I may have missed something important, but Justin, very happy to have you, and we get to know you through our friends at Cloud, and since you have given them some teaching on how to do a good presentation, we're really looking forward to learning from your expertise. Justin, if you can, give the time to you.
好，谢谢，真是真的很谢谢你给我这个机会，可以跟你们分享我所学的一些原则，关于那个 presentation skills. So that's a little bit of introduction in Chinese. I will use English for the most part. I am relatively comfortable with Chinese, but I think a little bit more comfortable with English in my presentations. 2,000 years ago, there was a Greek philosopher named Aristotle. And Aristotle at that time came up with what he believed were the key parts of a persuasive argument or a persuasive presentation. And although times have changed, certainly technology and culture has changed, people have not changed. And the principles that he came up with since then have been validated not only by presenters, but by scientists. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the art and science of delivering and preparing a persuasive presentation. Now, Aristotle came up with what he believed were the three most important aspects of a persuasive presentation. And they are ethos, pathos, and logos in the original Greek. And in English, they are credibility, emotion, and logic. He believed you needed all three of those aspects to have a very persuasive presentation. We're going to go into each one of those aspects today, probably not in depth because I don't have 3 or 4 hours that I do in my class that I teach at Western Digital. However, we're going to touch on some of these topics, and hopefully they will be some actionable insights that you can use when you prepare your own presentations. So let's dive in and look at it. So a couple of things just off the bat that I'd like to talk about. One of them is that I want each of you to know that you can deliver a persuasive presentation. And if you come away with nothing, remember that the principles that you learned today will help you to deliver a persuasive presentation. So a little bit of introduction. I've already been introduced. As mentioned, I'm an author and a deliverer of presentation skills class at Western Digital. That's what I do in my full spare time. They allow me to do that in addition to my regular job. And I've got some experience and passion for teaching and presentation skills. Now, you can have the greatest idea in the world, but if you cannot persuade others, then it doesn't matter. Ideas are the currency of our information world. And a great idea that isn't delivered well and persuasively doesn't really matter. So when you have your great ideas in your work or in your business or maybe at church, some of the idea won't matter unless you can persuade enough people that it is a great idea. We're going to go through each one of these, as I mentioned. And the first one that we're going to talk about is the one that we most often associate with a persuasive argument, and that is logic or data. Now, with logic, as mentioned, I come from an engineering background. I have a degree in computer science. In the first 5 years of my career, I spent as a software developer. And I thought that if you just had enough information that you could convince anybody of anything, but I no longer believe that. Now, one of the things when you want to do a logical presentation, here's one principle to remember, that people remember structured information 40% more reliably than unstructured. Well, what does that mean in context of a presentation? Well, what it means is that if you can provide some structure to your presentation, your audience will remember that presentation much more readily. So here's an example of a structure that you can provide for your presentation. What is, what if, and your solution. So this is a typical structure that you may provide when you're coming up with a solution to a problem or a new proposal. So here's an example of this. Steve Jobs is looked at by a lot of people as one of the best presenters of technical or product information ever. And one of his classic presentations was the iPhone introduction. This is the presentation where he introduced the iPhone for the first time. And at the beginning of his presentation, he introduced what is. So this is the what is part. And these are the smartphones that existed at that time. And his premise was those smartphones really weren't that smart. They were difficult to use. And they had several limitations. But that was what is. They had a fixed keyboard. They had a relatively small screen. And the stylus really wasn't that easy to use. So then he introduced the what if. Well, what could be? What if you could have a large screen that took up the whole all of the real estate on the phone? What if you didn't have to worry about a fixed keyboard? And what if you didn't have to use a stylus? You could use your finger, the most natural stylus of all. And what if all of these things just worked together like magic? Well, now the audience was practically salivating on what he was going to propose. And then he introduced the solution, the new iPhone. And his solution revolutionized, of course, the phone industry. But he proposed that iPhone as a solution to, well, look at, here's what is, but what if you didn't have to worry about that? And now the audience is waiting for, wow, yeah, that would be great if we didn't have to deal with all of those problems that you just mentioned. And now they're ready and waiting for your solution, which you introduce. Now, this is an example of a structure that you include in your presentation. And there's all sorts of different structures that you can use. You could say, here are the 5 reasons why you need to start saving for retirement right now. Or here are the, I'm going to tell you about why you need to start exercising or losing weight or whatever it is. And having a structure in your presentation will help your audience to remember the presentation much more easily. The next aspect of an argument that I'm going to talk about is credibility. And that people will see you as credible if someone else refers to you as an authority. Now, it's important in your presentation that you establish your credibility. And what that means is, why should people listen to you? What reason does the audience have to listen to you as a person that they should pay attention to? Well, one of the ways that you can establish yourself as an authority is to have somebody else refer to you as an authority. And it turns out that that person who refers to you as an authority doesn't necessarily have to be a person of authority themselves. It doesn't really matter who that person is. To illustrate this point, there was a study that was done. And in this study, they had people, they monitored people who called into a real estate office, and the secretary at the real estate office would answer in one of two ways. The first way that she would answer was, you want to speak to a real estate agent? Well, I'll put you through to Mary. She is one of our real estate agents. So that's the first way that she would answer. Now, the second way that she would answer was, I will put you through to Mary. She has 20 years of experience selling homes. Now, there was just a slight difference in between these two responses. One was, I'll put you through to Mary. She's one of our real estate agents. And the other was, I'll put you through to Mary. She has 20 years of experience selling homes. But with this very slight difference in response, there was a 20% increase in the number of appointments and a 15% increase in signed contracts. Now, the administrative assistant would hardly be considered an expert in real estate. However, when she referred to Mary as an experienced real estate agent, the number of appointments and signed contracts went up significantly. So you can use that in your presentations when you have somebody introduce you as an expert or an authority. Also, when you want to ensure that you have credibility, make sure you always fact check your information, because your audience can and will. There's many sites out there where the audience can immediately check, actually, even as you're speaking. So make sure that you always get your facts right and that you check it maybe once, maybe not more than once, maybe even twice, because your audience may, and as soon as you claim something that isn't true, you lose credibility in front of your audience. Now, a third way that you can have a persuasive argument or present a persuasive argument, the last one is emotion. Now, as mentioned, I was trained as an engineer, and I thought as long as you had logic, a logical argument, and enough data, you could convince anybody of anything. But I no longer believe that. What I believe right now, and this is because this has been borne out by science, and I'll talk about it in a little bit, that data leads us to conclusions, but emotion leads us to action. Data leads us to conclusions, but emotion leads us to action. Here's one of the scientific experiments or studies that backs this up. Antonio Damasio is an expert on decision-making and emotion. He's written several books about this subject and done several studies. And in one of the studies that Dr. Damasio has done was that he studied people whose emotional part of their brain was damaged. And these people could not feel any emotion at all. Now, you would think that these people would make totally logical decisions. They would be like Spock in Star Trek, and that their emotions wouldn't get in the way of their decision making, and they would just use 100% logic. Well, in fact, the opposite was the case. These people whose emotional part of their brain was not functioning, they couldn't feel emotion, could not make any decisions at all. They couldn't decide what to wear in the morning. They couldn't decide what to eat for breakfast. They could not make even the smallest decisions. And when Dr. Damasio asked these people, why can't you make any decisions? They said, we know what we should do. We just can't bring ourselves to do it. Data leads us to conclusions, but emotion leads us to action. Now, you may be asking, well, how am I going to bring emotion into my presentation at work? Are you expecting me to make everybody cry or burst out laughing or get angry? Well, there's actually a very easy way to introduce emotion into your presentation, and that is through storytelling. We all are natural-born storytellers. We've been telling stories for thousands and thousands of years. In fact, storytelling is the way that we have been able to transmit vital information for survival. Thousands of years ago, when we would gather around the campfire, people would tell stories about how they survived during a drought, or how they were able to find food when there was none around. And so storytelling was a way that we transmitted this vital information. And the purpose of storytelling in a presentation is to elicit emotion from your audience. Now, here's some examples of the type of emotion you may want to elicit from your audience. You want your audience to think, well, that's so unfair, or that process is so inefficient, or that's not right. Now, there was the next talk I believe is on Talk Like TED. Well, if you hadn't heard of TED, TED is a conference where some of the best presenters in the world gather together to transmit and to talk about different ideas that they had. A lot of people believe that if you get invited to speak at TED, that is the pinnacle of your presentation career. Well, there was an analysis done by Carmine Gallo, who's written several books on storytelling, he analyzed 500 different TED Talks. And what he determined was within those talks that 65% of the talks were emotion and story, 25% was data, and the other 10% was establishing credibility. So the most experienced presenters in the world use story and emotion to communicate their ideas. Jerome Bruner is an educator, and he had studied and came up with the conclusion that when you put data within a story, your audience is 22 times more likely to remember that. So when you combine logic and emotion, it becomes a very, very memorable and persuasive argument. So let me give you an example of this. So what if I told you, let's say that I worked for a company that sold backup software and for consumers. And I told you, I gave you a data point and I said 65% of consumers lost data from a computer or mobile device in 2019. You might say, wow, that's terrible. Wow, that's a pretty interesting statistic. And that might be the end of it. However, what if I gave you a story and I told you my hard drive, my personal hard drive failed, and I lost all of the photos and videos from the first 3 years of my children's lives. And my wife was so upset with me for doing that. And so I want you to check your backup solution today and consider our backup solution for backing up what's important to you. Now, all of a sudden, that becomes so real to you, and you're more motivated to take action. The data there led you to a conclusion. Wow, that's terrible. Wow, 65% of people lost data from their mobile or computer device. But when I introduce a story into it, now all of a sudden you get worried and you want to take action. So data leads us to conclusion, but emotion will lead us to action. Okay, I want to do a time check here. We're at 1:58. How much more time do I have?
You have 12 more minutes.
12 more minutes, perfect. Okay, thank you. Okay, now you may be convinced now that stories are effective in persuading people to take action, but what makes a great story? Not all stories are created equal. Well, let's take a look at the components of a great story. So first of all, a story needs to have people in it or characters. And there should be a main character, and that main character usually is the hero of the story, or the person who solves the problem, or maybe not. Sometimes an effective story has a problem that maybe isn't solved. And the main character should have some type of a goal, something that they want to achieve. They may not achieve it. Sometimes an example of a character not being able to achieve a goal is a good example that you want to show that, hey, maybe they failed, but they failed because maybe they weren't using your product or your idea. But there should be a main character, and that character should have a goal. And also, to make the story interesting, there should be some type of opposition. The main character should have some type of opposition to achieving their goal. That makes the story a lot more interesting and engaging for your audience. Without any opposition, there really isn't much interest into the story. Okay, yesterday I wanted to get some milk, so I went to the store and bought some milk. Not a very interesting story. But you say yesterday I needed to get some milk, and then I got in my car to go get it, and then there was a big storm, or I encountered, I had an accident or something. That all of a sudden makes the story more interesting. Now, motives of the main character will help your audience to relate to your character. If the character has motives that are good and that the audience can relate to, the audience gets more engaged. And if you can introduce some risk and some danger, so by risk means the chance of failure, and danger is what the consequences of those failure are. So if there's no risk or no danger, there's, again, it's not a really interesting story. But if you're introducing, let's say, a new process, there's some risk in that process failing. And the danger is, okay, if the process fails, then maybe you might get fired or something like that, right? That introduces an element of interest that keeps the audience interested in your story. Also, there needs to be a purpose in the story. Think about, how does the story relate to what you're trying to present to your audience? So there needs to be, the story needs to be related to the overall purpose of your presentation and what you're trying to get across to your audience. And then finally, what did the character or what can your audience learn from your story? Sometimes you'll tell a story just for entertainment purposes, but most often in your career, there should be something that the character has learned and that the audience can learn as a key takeaway from the story. With these elements in your story, it makes a great story if you have all of these and one that your audience will be engaged with. So again, in summary, a persuasive presentation a persuasive argument will have you will have credibility so that you establish credibility for you or maybe your company or your group. And it will have elements of logic and data, and also emotion, which you can establish by using a story in your presentation that is related to the point that you're trying to get across. So those are the three elements that Aristotle came up with. Now, I want to introduce something else that will help you to formulate your presentation. And that is what I've called the content development worksheet. And you'll get a copy of this presentation. So don't worry about taking a picture of the slide. You'll get a copy of this presentation in which I have the content development worksheet so that you can use it. Now, I came up with this content development worksheet after preparing presentations for over 30 years. And I had attended different presentation classes, listened to podcasts, attended different seminars on presentation skills. And I had seen worksheets done by other people or processes on how to develop a presentation that never really worked for me because they were too complicated or I didn't think they were relevant. And so I came up with my own. And I've been using this over the past 5 or 6 years. And I use it for every presentation that I do. I used it for this presentation. I used it when I gave a eulogy at my best friend's funeral. I also used it when I put together a presentation where I wanted to convince a friend to go hiking with me in Switzerland. And over 10 years, I've been trying to convince him. And finally, I used my content development worksheet, put together a presentation and said, hey, this is why you should come to me with Switzerland. And he finally agreed. So here's the content development worksheet. It's very simple. The first thing that you need to do is to determine who is your audience and what do they care about. A presentation to finance is going to look different than a presentation to engineering. And so you need to determine who is in your audience and what are the things that they care about. The next thing is outcomes. What do you want your audience to know as a result of your presentation? But more importantly, what is it that you want your audience to do as a result of your presentation? What action do you want them to take? Then here's the supporting material. This is the meat of your presentation. And remember to use emotion, logic, credibility, stories. And here you define each of your topics. And in my class, I go into this subject in quite a bit more detail. So I'm summarizing at a pretty high level, but you define your key topics that you want to address in your presentation. Then you determine your opening. How do you want to open? Because in your opening, you want to get the attention of your audience. For every presentation, you have about 30 seconds in which the audience will decide whether you're worth listening to or not. And so you want to be able to focus on your opening and get the attention of your audience, and then also determine your credibility, establish your credibility or credentials. And then finally, your closing. How do you want to close? And in your closing, you can summarize and or have a call to action to your audience. What do you want your audience to do? So this is the content development worksheet. It's pretty straightforward. There's nothing in here that I don't think that is really critical when you put together a presentation. And I do this before I start my PowerPoint slides. Here's an example of just the table. So just putting this into a tabular form. One of the things I added here was a headline. If there was one sentence that described my whole presentation, what would it be? And this often helps me to put together and focus on that one key idea that I want to have throughout my whole presentation. So that's the content development worksheet. Again, I use it all the time. I've developed it over several years. I teach this in my class. And if there was one thing that I would have you do, and that's use that content development worksheet to really have you focus and do the key elements of a great presentation. Okay, So let me go into a couple of other things. I'm in the interest of time. I want to talk a little bit about slides and just spend a few minutes, just a few minutes on slides, because one of the things, I think the thing that I see most often, the biggest problem that I see most often is that slides have too much information on them. And I see this pretty much every day, and it drives me crazy about it, that there's just too much information on a slide. Because remember, people can either listen to you or read your slides, but they can't do both at the same time. And people are there to listen to you. If they weren't, they could just take your slides and read them. So if you're not going to talk to it, put it in your backup slides. Okay, here's some techniques and some principles that you can use to make sure that your slides are simple. First one message per slide. Make sure each slide has a single message. If you can't identify a single message for your slide, chances are you've got too much and you're trying to communicate too much. There's nothing wrong with splitting a slide into 3 slides. It won't extend your presentation. It will just make it easier for your audience to consume the information. Try not to have any more than 6 points on a slide. Minimize the number of colors that you have on a slide. And then try to ensure that you have only a single image on a slide. Now, there may be times when you want to break these guidelines, but make sure that you have a very good reason to do that. 99% of the time, you should be able to adhere to these principles of simplicity to have simple slides for your audience. One other tip also is to use the power of 3. When you group information into groups of 3, it makes it easier for your audience and people in general to remember, because our short-term memory can only hold 3 to 4 pieces of information. You hear this in stop, drop, and roll. That's what children are instructed to do when they're in a fire in a building. They need to stop, they need to drop down on the floor, and then roll away. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are what our founding forefathers believed, and they had 3 things. Red, yellow, and green for stoplights, the ABCs of. Use the power of 3 in your presentations, and it will make it much more memorable. So here's one example of taking a slide that's really text-based and making it simple. I don't know if you've heard about Airbnb. Airbnb is a company that allows people to list their homes on a website and people to rent them out. And it's pretty much revolutionized the hospitality industry. But in Airbnb, the founders of Airbnb, this is a story about how Airbnb started. They had a problem. They were living in San Francisco. Their rent was just raised by $500 and they couldn't pay it that month. They just didn't have the money. Well, they noticed that there was a conference in San Francisco and attendees needed places to stay. And they thought, what if we put air beds in our apartment, 3 air beds, and allowed people to stay there and gave them breakfast? And that's how Airbnb came up with air bed, bed and breakfast, air bed and breakfast. Now, this is a slide that there's nothing wrong with it. It's pretty textual though, not very interesting. What if you change your slide to make it look like something like this? And you talk to it. You tell the story of the founders of Airbnb and how they couldn't make their rent, and how then they came up with the idea of putting a bed in different places of their apartment, here, here, and here. So that's a lot more visual. So it's just one example of taking a slide and making it more visual. So with that, what I want to do right now is open it up to Q&A. And after Q&A, I'm going to have one more tip. So I'm going to open up for Q&A for roughly 10 to 12 minutes. So we don't have to take up all the time, but I do want to open up for Q&A, any questions that you might have on presentations. And then after that, at about, let's say, let me see, 2:20 or 2:25, somewhere around there, I have one more tip to tell you about. So what I'd like to do is open it up for any questions that people might have.
Justin, we may only have time for a couple questions.
Okay, absolutely. Yes, that's fine. Yep.
Thank you.
Wait, so for the story, then, does it have to be a personal story?
No, absolutely not. No, personal stories are very effective a lot of times on what happened to me, but it does not have to be a personal story. You can use a story from your group, from your company. You can use a story that you just read about on somebody else, as long as it relates to the topic and it's relevant to the topic that you're discussing. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a personal story.
Also, can a story have too much emotion?
Yeah, for business, yeah. I mean, you have to use your judgment on how emotional that you might want to make it. Now, again, there are different emotions. People might have an emotion of urgency. Okay, this story that you just talked about, so back to the story where I talked about how I lost, the first 3 years of my children's lives, that may introduce some urgency into the viewers or the listeners on, hey, I need to do something about my backup solution. And so, yes, you in a business situation, yeah, don't try to make the story too emotional. But again, there's lots of different emotions that people can experience that will make them take action. Again, hey, that's really inefficient, or wow, we need to get doing that. Otherwise, we may have a real problem here, right? Or yeah, that's a great way sounds like a great idea on how to make more money or how to increase our margins. Let's do that. So yeah, emotions, yeah, you definitely do have to watch in a business environment that you don't make it too emotional.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay. Let me ask the second question. So,
sure.
I actually have there's an echo here for some reason. I have a presentation actually tomorrow 7 a.m. to an executive. So your teaching here is really very timely. The question I have is, how much percentage of time you think I should spend telling stories, and is it going to be different from audience to audience?
Yeah, it might vary from audience to audience. I would suggest that it doesn't need to be a time. And in fact, you can tell an effective story just in a couple of sentences. Let me give you an example. Yesterday, my wife came to me and said, we should get an Apple TV. And then in the next sentence, she said, wait, what is an Apple TV? What does it do? So that's the story. Now, this is a story that illustrates the power of brand identity. She wanted an Apple TV and yet had no idea what it did. She was so enamored and loyal to the brand that she wanted to buy the product even though she didn't know what it was. So you can story very quickly, and you don't have to use a lot of time on that. So yes, I don't suggest, in a business situation, stories shouldn't probably be any more than 4 to 5 minutes at the most. Ideally, just 1 or 2 minutes to talk about a story, but anywhere from 1 to 2 minutes at the most, 4 to 5 minutes. And your presentation shouldn't be all stories, but it should be a way to introduce your point and introduce some emotional feelings into the audience. That doesn't mean that, again, your story has to be about emotions, but it allows your audience to have an emotional response, which then makes them want to take action.
Thank you. That's super helpful. I don't think everybody is unmuted, but let me offer my claps. Just really thank you, Justin, for this it's a great presentation.
Thank you. To end, I want to close in giving you a challenge in that in the next presentation that you have, I want you to do 2 things. The first is take a look at the presentation worksheet that I have and see if you can't use it when you prepare your next presentation. So that's my challenge number 1. My second challenge is see if you can define a story, introduce a story into your presentation that will help your audience to want to take action. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it. And I think my contact information should be available to everybody. If it isn't, certainly you can make my contact information available. And if anybody has any questions about presentations, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay. If you can unshare your desktop.
I will do that.
And so our next speaker is Mercy. Mercy, do you want to start introducing yourself, and we'll take care of the sharing part.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for Justin's information. It's a little bit overlap with the video I'm going to present to you. Okay. And 大家好，我是 Mercy。1996年我从台湾移民到加拿大，现在跟我的先生还有2个孩子定居在温哥华，加拿大。我觉得也是谢谢这个疫情，让我可以在空中加入大家。我刚才听到说这个明年也许可能不会在线上了，让我有点难过哈。不过我觉得我非常的珍惜这一次的机会。那上一个月我们聚集的时候，我做了一个 book reports 有关于口的哈，有关于这个怎么样演讲，那么让我回忆很多我过去的一些回忆。然后呢，也让我有一点反省，知道说，其实，在过去的一些机会当中，神使用我的口，事实上真的是毁灭很多人。那我觉得，当我的生命也慢慢的长大成熟之后，我觉得神也从我的心开始改变，也慢慢的去调整我的口，让我的口能够说出真的是对的话语，就像金苹果落在银网子里面。那希望呢，这个 book report 我所学习到的，也跟大家一起分享，一起来学习。那刚才 Justin 也提到了那个3个这个部分，在演讲当中，那我里面呢也有提到，就是育情、育理、育德的部分。好，那我觉得这个是非常非常合适的。我觉得在每一个演讲当中，我觉得我们都可以共同来学习。那在这个 video 当中呢，我自己学习最多的就是当我们要说的时候，从我们的心里面说出来，真的是让神的那个我们为耶稣基督燃烧的那个爱，可以透过我们的心，然后透过这个学习我们的学习的技能，然后到我们的口中能够被属所使用呀。好，那现在请那个苏晨可以帮我们放一下 video， 谢谢。大家好，我是 Mercy， 今天很开心跟大家一起来分享一本有关于演讲的书籍，名字叫做《像 TED 一样的演讲》 Talk Like TED。 在我国小4年级的时候，我得到了一个代表全年级的演讲机会。为了这个难得可遇不可求的机会，我的妈妈要不断的陪我背诵演讲稿，在学校也有专门的老师来为我做演讲的训练。老师会个别的纠正我的阴阳顿挫发音，调整我的手势，关注我的脸部表情，声音大小。我凭借着这样的训练，得到了很多校内和校外的肯定。我以为这就是准备演讲的全貌，只等到在几年前，我看到了在 TED 上面的演讲，才发现原来演讲比我所知道的还要有更多的关注点。一场好的演讲不只是有外在的吸引力，更重要的是那些吸引力是被内在所激发出来的爆发力。也许演讲者的咬字不清，或许也带着口音，但是他们的眼神总是充满着光辉，好像每一个字都可以穿透到我的心。我似乎在他们的演讲中感受到人性、激情、梦想和与他们的连结。所以我带着很谦卑的心态，透过这本书，我想要重新的再来学习如何演讲。我想从3个角度来学习这本书。第一个角度是我个人过去 到现在的经历。第二个是这本书里面所提到的重点。第三个，我会引用 TED 上面的一场演讲，让大家有更多直观的感受和体验。虽然今天没有办法涵盖书上所有的深度和细节，但是期待的是，分享之后，大家会渴望的去读这本书，或者是浸泡在 TED 的演讲里面，继续的来学习。我们很快的进入到本书的3大重点。第一个是情感，第二部分是新奇，最后一部分是难忘。我们讲到情感的部分，首先我们在演讲之前，我们要想一件很重要的课题，就是主题的选择。为什么会这么重要呢？因为只有在演讲者对演讲主题充满热情的前提之下，其他的因素才能够发挥作用。最简单的方法就是问自己，什么能够让我的心灵歌唱？如果这句话还没有办法让你有更具体的想法，我们先来看一段影片之后，也许会让你在情感上有更深的感受。
James Comer says that no significant learning can occur without a significant relationship. George Washington Carver says all learning is understanding relationships. Everyone in this room has been affected by a teacher or an adult. For years, I have watched people teach. I have looked at the best and I've looked at some of the worst. A colleague said to me one time, they don't pay me to like the kids. They pay me to teach a lesson. The kids should learn it. I should teach it. They should learn it. Case closed. Well, I said to her, you know, kids don't learn from people they don't like. She said, that's just a bunch of hooey. And I said to her, well, your year is going to be long and arduous, dear. Needless to say, it was. Some people think that you can either have it in you to build a relationship or you don't. I think Stephen Covey had the right idea. He said you ought to just throw in a few simple things, like seeking first to understand as opposed to being understood. Simple things like apologizing. You ever thought about that? Tell a kid you're sorry, they're in shock. I taught a lesson once on ratios. I'm not real good with math, but I was working on it. And I got back and looked at that teacher edition. I taught the whole lesson wrong. So I came back to class the next day and I said, look, guys, I need to apologize. I taught the whole lesson wrong. I'm so sorry. I said, that's okay, Miss Pearson. You were so excited. We just let you go.
先来介绍一下这个演讲者是 Rita Pearson， 她是一名教育者，所以在我剪辑的这个影片当中，我们可以来关注一下书上所提到情感的几个要点，看看大家是不是能够在上面所列出的要点中，在 Rita 的演讲里面找得到。我们来看第一个， Rita 有找到能够让她热情的主题吗？答案很清楚，对教育的热情爆表，对不对？第二个，外表的部分，中国人说人要衣装，你觉得外国人也很重视吗？是的，一个与演讲内容不搭衬的着装，不合宜的举止，像是手插口袋啦、敲桌子、转笔、抠鼻子、抓痒一些不经意的小动作，可能会引起观众的不好意思、紧张。第三个部分是Rita 有让你觉得像好友般近距离吗？是的，好友般的谈话就是很自然、很亲切，而且可以感觉到被信赖。我们可以透过不断的练习，把演讲的内容内化于心，就可以更自然、流畅的来演讲，好像跟好朋友说话一样。最理想的语速是在每分钟的150到160个单字，比口语稍微慢一点， 让大家可以比较好的吸收，也注意要停顿哦。动机的部分，如果你的力量是来自于你的内心，那么这是一场很棒的演讲。如果缺乏热情的话，你的气场将会严重的被减弱。我们用故事把你的思想和情感植入在观众的大脑里面。当观众获取了启发，他就愿意的去传播他们喜欢的信息和思想，创造扩散的效应。故事就是有灵魂的数据，非常的有人情味，而且故事中大量描述性的语言，生动的表达，让故事想象就是自己好像就在那发生的现场一样。故事最好是个人化，越个人化就越好。所以你可以试试看，在你下次的演讲里面，故事永远是屡试不爽的演讲的素材。最后一个，寓情、寓理跟寓德，这三个代表的是说服力，这是三大要素。寓情，它应该要占的是65%的演讲内容，是代表情感的吸引力。寓理可能代表是25%的内容，说明了证据跟数据。寓德是可信度，占了10%。所以上面的这几个要点，就是有关于情感方面的几个重点的诉求。我们来看第二部分，新奇。一场好的演讲是要使听演讲者他能够得到新的讯息，在他们的大脑当中形成一个新的思维，成为一个新的回路，而且帮助我们可以跨过舒适圈进入成长。接下来我们要从下面的这个影片来觉察一下，是不是这个演讲者他有带入新的方法，帮助突破困难，跨越成功呢？我们一起来看。
I have had classes that were so low, so academically deficient that I cried. I wondered, how am I going to take this group in 9 months from where they are to where they need to be? And it was difficult. It was awfully hard. How do I raise the self-esteem of a child and his academic achievement at the same time? One year I came up with a bright idea. I told all my students, you were chosen to be in my class because I am the best teacher and you are the best students. They put us all together so we could show everybody else how to do it. One of the students said, really? I said, really? We have to show the other classes how to do it. So when we walk down the hall, people will notice us. So you can't make noise. You just have to strut. And I gave him a saying to say, I am somebody. I was somebody when I came. I'll be a better somebody when I leave. I am powerful and I am strong. I deserve the education that I get here. I have things to do, people to impress, and places to go. And they said, yeah. You say it long enough, it starts to be a part of you. And so I gave a quiz, 20 questions. Student missed 18. I put a +2 on this paper and a big smiley face. He said, Miss Pearson, is this an F? I said, yes. He said, then why'd you put a smiley face? I said, because you on the roll. You got 2 right, you didn't miss them all. I said, and when we review this, won't you do better? He said, yes, ma'am, I can do better. You see, -18 sucks all the life out of you. +2 said, I ain't all bad.
Rita 当他使用了新奇的元素的时候，你看带来什么样的结果呢？我们一起来探讨一下。Rita 带来了一个新的视角。当我们用不同的方式，你是-18还是+2的时候，一个全新的讯息 或是为老问题提出了新鲜新奇的解决方法，就能够帮助听众跳出思维的方式，拥有一个看世界的一个新视角。因为大脑喜欢新奇的事物，出其不意的元素会激发那个观众的好奇心，刺激了大脑。第二部分是说故事。我们在说故事的时候，如果我们选用的是高潮迭起的故事，大脑就会觉得好好玩，好新奇。G 代表的是好运气， I 代表的是坏运气。所以当我们在说故事的时候，我们利用的是 GIG 的一个迭起的方法，会带来一个很新奇的效果。第三个，幽默。幽默能够消除观众的心理防线，而且更能够接受信息，增加你个人的魅力，为你的演讲加分。那接下来我们要看的是，当听见如果令人情绪激昂的这个信息，你知道就可以增加多巴胺的分泌量，这可以增加我们的记忆力。就好像那个便利贴贴上了你要记住这件事，所以你需要来调动这个观众的情绪。多巴胺是一个很棒的元素。还有最后一个就是非语言的表达，可以让观众这种掉下巴的这种环节，譬如说使用道具啊、噱头啊，可以抓住观众的注意力，而且又能够让别人觉得很难忘。第三个部分呢是难忘的。一个好的 TED 演讲，我们要使用难忘的这个元素。Rita 她有提到之前的故事里面提到她之前所说的一些栽种，然后现在呢，她要开始收割果子了。我们来听听看。
For years, I watched my mother take the time at recess to review, go on home visits in the afternoon, buy combs and brushes and peanut butter and crackers to put in her desk drawer for kids that needed to eat, and a washcloth and some soap for the kids who didn't smell so good. See, it's hard to teach kids who stink. And kids can be cruel. And so she kept those things in her desk, and years later, after she retired, I watched some of those same kids come through and say to her, you know, Miss Walker, you made a difference in my life. You made it work for me. You made me feel like I was somebody when I knew at the bottom I wasn't. And I want you to just see what I've become. And when my mama died 2 years ago at 92, there were so many former students at her funeral. It brought tears to my eyes, not because she was gone, but because she left a legacy of relationships that could never disappear. Can we stand to have more relationships? Absolutely. Will you like all your children? Of course not. And you know your toughest kids are never absent. Never. You won't like them all, and the tough ones show up for a reason. It's the connection. It's the relationships. And while you won't like them all, the key is they can never, ever know it. So teachers become great actors and great actresses, and we come to work when we don't feel like it, and we listen to policy that doesn't make sense, and we teach anyway. We teach anyway because that's what we do. Teaching and learning should bring joy. How powerful would our world be if we had kids who were not afraid to take risks, who were not afraid to think, and who had a champion? Every child deserves a champion, an adult who will never give up on them, who understands the power of connection and insists that they become the best that they can possibly be. Is this job tough? You betcha. Oh God, you betcha. But it is not impossible. We can do this. We're educators. We're born to make a difference. Thank you so much.
是的，我们能够与众不同，我们可以让一场演讲成为难忘的演讲。所以在这个难忘的部分，我总结了3个数字。第一个是18。当我们在做一场演讲的时候，不要超过12到18分钟，因为信息量如果太大，我们会影响我们思想的传播，也同时会帮助演讲者在思路上可以专注在重点上面。第二个数字是3，大脑对于3的记忆为最好， 如果是3点是最容易记住的，就像刘同牧师的讲道一样。第3个数字呢是5，我们的5个多感官的体验。大脑如果没有刺激，就会觉得无聊。所以像我今天就动用了视频的方式，动用了大家听觉还有视觉的效果。那最后我们来复习一下重点。一场脍炙人口的演讲要考虑到情感的方面。卓越的传播者，他能够抓住你的注意力的同时，还打动你的心灵，找出真正能够让你热血沸腾的东西，懂得用说故事的方式拉近了观众与你演讲的主题的距离，运用肢体语言与你的听众聊天，与听众有更深入、更有意义的联系。在新奇的方面，我们要创造新鲜幽默的方式来吸引听众的注意，让你的独特跟意想不到的演说可以脱颖而出。最后要运用18分钟的法则，3个重点，创造生动多感官的感受，让观众能够记得住，而且成功的让你的演讲内容传播分享出去，带出影响力。希望今天有增加大家的多巴胺，减少大家对演讲的这种恐惧，提高了开口的自信。期待大家都能够创作自己 TED 高光时刻，成为一位热情为神国发光、改变世界的传播者。谢谢大家。
好，谢谢 Mercy 这么棒的一个 video， 这么棒的这个presentation。那我想给大家问问题的机会哈，不过因为时间关系，可能只能问1个问题，其他的我们可以通过 email 可以发给我，可以转给 Mercy 哈。因为 Mercy 是我们 CGW 的学员之一哈，他会在这里，所以我们可以随时可以问他，好不好？现在问一下有没有问题？
我可以问一个问题吗？
请问。
OK，Mercy，你讲的非常的好。这个但是在我们湾区这些工程师，好像太多的 emotion， 这些可能他们不太难以接受啊。这个你是不是有什么别的这种想法？
这个理工男理工女对吧？我相信其实在 TED 这本书演讲里面呢，他很强调就是你的心。其实当我们对每一个人就好像当朋友一样从心里面出发的时候，其实可以讲很多你个人的见证。我觉得我自己在服事的这个对象当中，我常常举我自己的见证的时候这是最真实的呀，他可以从我们心里面的分享当中就可以体会到我们的情感了。虽然也许我们可能脸部没有什么太大的表情呀，但是我觉得那个距离，心理的距离是很近的，所以大家可以试试看，多发掘，然后也许在平常的时候呢，可以把你的小见证可能把它写下来呀，然后像我自己的见证，我常常把它记录下来。那常常有时候去感恩，然后让我们有机会的时候，在这个合适的时间呢，都可以拿出来分享。
好，谢谢再次谢谢Mercy， 也谢谢Justin， 那谢谢大家的attention。那我做一个简短的报告，那我们就进入到小组哈。那也许你们都有看到 email， 我们12月就没有这个 career panel， 我们把12月定为这个活动月，希望每个小组呢都有自己的季局哈，不管是实体还是现场，就是希望借这个机会学员们在自己的组里面能够有更多的 connection， 也借这个机会，如果欠下的作业的话请大家去补一下，因为真的只有去 practice 的时候我们才会进步哈。非常谢谢今天的这个非常及时的 presentation。那我看一下，我明天这个早上7点钟的 presentation 可能要改得很厉害了不过我非常高兴哈。 我也可以跟大家下一次做个报告，到底有没有这个达到更好的效果？我相信一定会有哈。我觉得今天的这个 video 也会在 YouTube 上，以后我想我有重要的 presentation， 我可能会都先看一遍啊，再去做。好，那时间关系我们就到这里啊，再次谢谢大家，也感谢我们的神给我们一切的恩典，祝福大家在这个感恩节的季节里面充满感恩的心我相信今年还有一个多月的时间，会有很多奇妙的事情发生在我们当中。好，1月份见。